Thank you for having us on. It's great to be with the Young Ecosocialists. And Margaret Flowers and Kevin Zeese were the co-directors of popularresistance.org. I'm also a co-chair of the National Green Party and active in our local in Baltimore and state of Maryland parties. And Kevin, do you want to say?
Sure. I'm also on the Green Party's National Committee and on our Maryland Green Party Coordinating Council. Been active Green since 2000 or so, and been to Venezuela a couple of times. I'll talk about those trips when we get to that part of the discussion, and looking forward to having a conversation with people. Thanks for all being here.
Great. So should I just go ahead and start?
Sure.
All right. So we thought we would kind of break this up into 4 pieces, talk a little bit about the background, about the Embassy Protection Collective, some updates on what's been happening with Venezuela since we left the embassy, and then the last section talk about tactics. And I understand that you all did a call with Dakota Lilly a while back, and that they explained a lot about the background. So we won't go into that in too much detail. But if you have questions, we can certainly answer those. But the basics of what we all need to know is that prior to Chavez's election in 1998, there was great wealth inequality in Venezuela. It's a country that's rich in resources, and there were high rates of poverty, and then there were very extreme wealthy people there. Folks told us down there, it was the kind of thing where kids got a new car every year. They did vacations to Europe with all their wait staff and families, and it was just these extreme levels of wealth. And then these areas of the country that had no resources, weren't on the map, very high poverty. So after Chavez was elected, they started the Bolivarian process, which was really reversing that neoliberalism and using the assets of the country to lift up the people and provide their basic needs. So they made great strides in basically eradicating illiteracy. They created a new constitution that gave the right to vote and various other rights like to housing and healthcare and education. And so they built hospitals and clinics and social housing and all these things that they did. And so the United States ever since then has also been working very hard to try to stop the Bolivarian process. And early on through a coup attempt that lasted for 2 days in 2002, and then onward, the first unilateral coercive measures. Oops, I don't know. There's an echo, Patrick. Maybe if you can mute.
Yeah, and I can mute people as well when I start seeing it.
Okay, so then where was it? Oh, the first unilateral coercive measures with people called sanctions happened under President Bush. Then, of course, in 2015, President Obama declared Venezuela a national security threat, which meant that a lot of investors wouldn't invest in Venezuela. They kind of saw where the whole thing was going, and then an escalation of the unilateral coercive measures since then. And in January of this year, well, I'm sure you're all aware that they tried to delegitimize the elections in May of 2018. That was not successful. They were able to have their election. They had over 9 million voters come out. 67%, I think it was, voted for President Maduro. And then in August, there was an assassination attempt against him in 2018. And then in January of this year, the United States backed a coup attempt installing this guy, Juan Guaido, as the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, somebody that 80% of Venezuelans had no idea who he was. He was the president of the National Assembly, which is actually not an active governing body right now because it's in contempt of court. And so that failed. They weren't able to mobilize support for Juan Guaido in Venezuela, and so they brought that coup attempt to the United States. And maybe you can talk about that and also our visit.
Well, let me first talk about our visit in March, and I actually had visited also in May of last year during the presidential election. So I can talk a little about that as well. And I think what's important is that there has been as Margaret said, a long-term economic war going on against Venezuela by the United States. And that economic war has definitely had an impact. I mean, the purpose of the economic war is to destroy the economy. And it's an economic war that's not just coming from the United States, but also from the oligarchs in Venezuela. Venezuela still is a capitalist society. The 70% of their economy is capitalist. And so there still are business interests that have power, and they have been abusing that power, hoarding goods, hoarding food, selling food in Colombia, not in Venezuela. And at the same time, the U.S. has been adding to their problems with the economic sanctions and unilateral coercive measures. So when we went there in March, we were looking forward to seeing what was really happening, because you hear all these reports in the United States about how terrible things are in Venezuela. But when we got to Venezuela, we were actually arrived in the midst of the blackout. The blackout was a week-long blackout that was caused by a U.S. cyber attack primarily, but also some attacks on the ground in Venezuela, but a cyber attack that emanated from Houston and Chicago. So it was interesting to see how Venezuelans responded to that. We didn't see any looting, despite the blackout and the difficulties that would mean for law enforcement. People instead came together and worked together to try to solve the problems that the country faced. They would help each other get water from water sources, because water piping wasn't working. The pumps didn't have any electricity to pump water up, so they had to get water from other sources. So people would be carrying water for long distances. And so rather than seeing this kind of division and crisis, you saw unification. And people are smart in Venezuela. They know this is part of a U.S. plan, a U.S. effort to cause a crisis and give an excuse for U.S. intervention. They didn't want to give that excuse. And so we saw that throughout our visit in Venezuela. One of the major areas impacted by the unilateral coercive measures is the ability to get certain medicines. Venezuela had a very thriving pharmaceutical industry, one of the best in Latin America. But because of the inability to get the ingredients for the precursors for medicine, half that industry has closed down. And that's made it very hard to get certain medicines. It was really interesting on television. They would have almost like public service announcements saying that a certain person at a certain address needed a specific medicine. If you have some, share it. And this is, I think, part of the Bolivarian process of creating a community based on a goal toward working towards socialism. I think you get this kind of camaraderie and working together. And so it was interesting when we were there to see how well informed the Venezuelan people are about U.S. imperialism. They're very aware they are under attack economically by the United States. And it's not caused them to attack Maduro. In fact, it caused them to unify around Maduro and bring the country together. And we got to see a sense of how this deep political education occurred when we went to see the most popular television show in Venezuela. It's a television show that's hosted by the head of the National Constituent Assembly. It's a 6-hour television show. And it's the most popular show in Venezuela, 6 hours long. And what the show involves is music, songs about the revolution and politics, dance. It has videos like you see on Saturday Night Live, making fun of some of the political issues. And the head of the National Constituent Assembly goes through a series of news. He had 80 postcards, and he went through each postcard, which is a news story, and going into the depth of the involvement of John Bolton, the role of Elliot Abrams and Donald Trump and Juan Guaido. And Juan Guaido was a butt of jokes for that audience. He's not taken seriously by the vast majority of Venezuelan people. He could not win an election. I have no doubt about that. And so we got to see the deep political education. And we also got to see, when we visited various neighborhoods, we visited a barrio of 1.5 million people, for example. And prior to Chavez, this barrio was not even on the map because it got no services, no government services. Now you go into that community, you see dental clinics, health clinics, schools, community centers, urban gardens. You see transportation, buses and subways. It's a thriving community. But prior to Chavez, it had nothing. And that's why the opposition cannot win elections. Because the bottom line is the Maduro government and the Chavez government have greatly improved the lives of the people of Venezuela. Despite this economic war, for example, they have built more than 2 million social housing units, which are for the poorest Venezuelans. Even Colombians who have fled Colombia because of the violence are given free homes. We looked for homeless people and couldn't find them. And so we've seen there was tremendous improvement. Now, just say one point about the election. I was there for the election. It did exist. Maduro is not a dictator. There were multiple candidates running. Maduro won the election. They have an excellent election system. It starts with a right to vote in the Constitution, and the election day ends with actually comparing the paper ballot with the electronic ballot in a public audit, a citizen's audit. So everybody can see this is a real election. Here's the vote. Look at it. And they count it, and they count it. If it's accurate, then that means the count will stand as accurate. If not, they'll count every paper ballot in that precinct. 54% of machines have to go through a people's audit on election day. No other country in the world does that. Venezuela takes democracy very seriously, not just voting rights, but down to the community level with community councils and general assemblies making decisions for their communities. It's really a democracy to see. We can learn a lot from it if we stop calling it a dictatorship.
I just want to add that one of the things that was very distressing is because the coup attempts failed in Venezuela is that they've basically moved that effort to the United States and are trying to give the illusion of the success of the coup. And so the United States has recognized Juan Guaido as the president, as have Canada, the right-leaning Latin American countries as well as European countries have recognized Juan Guaido. But then the United States did another thing that I think is really unprecedented, and that is it started handing over the assets, the Venezuelan assets, to Juan Guaido. And so billions of dollars, the Citgo was given over, the UN consulate in New York City and the 2 military attaché offices in Washington, D.C. were handed over to Juan Guaido's people. And although protesters, tried to go and stop the handover of those buildings because they found out about it as it was happening, they weren't able to stop them from doing that. So that's kind of the lead up to the whole Embassy Protection Collective. And why don't we take a break there and see if anybody has any pressing questions about kind of the events leading up to the Embassy Protection Collective. And if you don't, we'll just pop that.
If you don't have any questions, we're happy to go on.
I just want to say that everything that you all said, totally agree with. What I saw,
totally, and we went to a housing commune, in fact, and we went to 3 urban collectives. And so later on in the thing, I'd like to share some of that. But absolutely, everything that you said, 100%.
We can't hear you, Chris. You're muted, Chris.
Anybody else?
Sorry,
Anybody else for Stack? I had everybody muted because of the echo. So.
Whoops.
So did
Diane?
you not hear what I said then?
No,
We heard you. We heard you.
Oh, okay.
And I've got Diane.
Oh, good. Thank you. So I was wondering, how come there's such an exodus of people from Venezuela? Like Colombia has huge refugee camps and stuff. So evidently there's there's lots of problems. I only hear about all these horrible problems where people can't get medicine and food and all that.
Right. So it's really important to understand that pretty much everything you hear in the corporate media in the United States is false about Venezuela or is twisted in some way. The reality is, and you can look at the CIA, fact book, that compared to other Latin American countries, emigration from Venezuela is low. And actually more Colombians have come into Venezuela fleeing violence in Colombia than vice versa. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, there's a lot of people crossing the border each day, as there are in any border in the world, but the vast majority of them go back at the end of the day. They're going for work or for whatever. So, when they talk about all these people crossing the border, that doesn't mean that they're actually leaving the country. And in fact, Venezuela is starting to work with some folks that did leave because of hardship, and to repatriate them, to help them to be able to come back. There are, I was looking because I heard, about the problems with food. And so, I was always looking at like the babies and the children as a pediatrician, and babies all looked fat and happy. The kids all looked well fed and, active. And you saw food really literally everywhere. On the corners, there were produce stands. In town, there were food trucks. The stores, had food on the shelves. They didn't have everything you wanted. You went to a restaurant and you'd have to say, what do you have today? And they'd say, well, we have these like 2 or 3 things. So people are getting adequate amounts of food, I would say, but not always the choices of food that they want. And Venezuela is taking tremendous strides to produce their own food, especially growing fruits and vegetables. And they have a whole urban agriculture ministry that's working on that. And in these communities, they have greenhouses and other things. They're raising protein as well, rabbits and things like that. So they're taking steps to deal with the problems that they're having because they haven't been able to import as much food as they were able to do before.
But there is an economic war.
Yeah.
And the goal of the economic war is to destroy the economy. Even if that means people die from lack of medicine or lack of food.
That's a big issue.
There have been 40,000 deaths in Venezuela, according to a recent report by the Center for Economic and Policy Analysis Research in Washington, D.C. CEPR estimated 40,000 deaths due to U.S. sanctions. And so I think it's very important for us to understand what the cause of this is. In addition to what Margaret said, in addition, I mentioned the 2 million plus homes that they built, they also have a program called the CLAP program, which is a program that provides households, was it 6 million?
6 million households.
6 million households every 2 weeks with a box of basic goods for the kitchen: flour, pasta, even cleaning supplies, and oils. It's sold for pennies a box. And there's also CLAP stands around the city where you can actually purchase food as well. And so they are making a big effort. It's interesting. One of the recent sanction efforts by the United States was to sanction those involved in running the CLAP program. Is that obnoxious or what? The people who are trying to provide food to Venezuelans are now being sanctioned by the United States. And so, yes, there are problems, but we found in Venezuela great exaggeration. One thing I didn't mention in my opening was we were there when the American Airlines stopped flying to Venezuela because they said there was such widespread civil unrest and because Americans could be arrested at any time for no reason.
That's what they said. We
went out on the streets and filmed that civil unrest. It was families walking in parks, walking in the walking streets, having ice cream and going out for meals. It was a beautiful environment. People were getting along fine. There were no threats of arrest. It was the exact opposite of the truth. Now, one of the challenges we have talking to audiences in the United States is when we tell the truth, what we actually saw with our own eyes, we come across as we're apologists for Venezuela, the dictator, authoritarian Maduro, all false. But by telling the truth, we look like we're just like, just lying about how great Venezuela is. We are trying to get the truth across in an environment that's surrounded by lies. So it's a very difficult process. If you want to really understand Venezuela, we've been covering Venezuela intensely on Popular Resistance. Just go popularresistance.org/tag/Venezuela. You will see literally hundreds of articles about what's going on in Venezuela.
Shall we go into the next session?
Any other questions, Chris, or should we go on?
I'd say let's move on.
Yeah, there's a lot. So for this session, we're going to talk about the collective, and I thought I would show the PowerPoint.
There's a very bad echo. Are other people getting a bad echo?
I'll mute everybody but Margaret and Kevin when they're talking, and then unmute for the questions.
The power seconds.
Yeah.
And they'll rotate again, and they'll just show you what was going on in the embassy and outside the embassy during the collective.
Do you want to talk about the kind of the OAS code?
Yeah, I'll talk about how this began. So we, as Margaret mentioned, the 2 military attachés in Washington, D.C. and diplomatic offices in New York had been given by the U.S. government over to the opposition. They were essentially trying to use the Venezuelan buildings, diplomatic buildings, to create an outer power government, a shadow government. And those buildings actually are not being used much, but they now have been vacated and are available for the opposition. And so we saw that the Organization of American States recognized Juan Guaido. They did this after a manipulated vote. Normally it requires a 2/3 vote for there to be a recognition of a new government. They were able to change that to a majority vote and barely got a majority. And when we saw that happen, we knew that their goal was to take over this embassy, this Georgetown embassy that's 4 floors plus a basement plus 2 garage floors, massive building. 80 people work there at its peak, and it's in the heart of Georgetown. And the idea was to take that over. And so we knew that was their goal. We, along with Code Pink, Medea Benjamin was very critical in getting this started.
And Answer.
And the Answer Coalition joined us after as well. We decided to stay in the embassy to protect it with the permission of the Venezuelan government. We described ourselves as interim protectors, because when you have a diplomatic relations broken, what normally happens is you have protecting power agreements. And so in Venezuela, Caracas, the U.S. embassy, was going to be protected by Switzerland. In Washington, D.C., Turkey was going to be the protecting power of the embassy of Venezuela in Georgetown. And we were going to be the interim protectors as that was negotiated.
Right, so they were in the process of negotiating that. The U.S. had asked Venezuela to recognize Switzerland, and Venezuela said, well, when we find a protecting power and you recognize that, we'll recognize yours. So we were there as Venezuela was doing those negotiations with Turkey.
And so when we first got there, the first 2 weeks were, we could go in and out of the embassy with no problem. We organized forums every night, or cultural events, musical events every night. And we had dozens or more than 100 people come to these events. And these events were on Honduras, they were on Venezuela, they were on AFRICOM, they were on this is a CIA regime change from the inside of the CIA. We had a former CIA official, John Kiriakou, talk about what it was like in the CIA and how they do regime change. We did that the night before, actually, we expected the U.S. government to come in and take the embassy. So that was a pretty remarkable event. But on April 30th, there was an additional coup attempt. Okay, you go ahead.
Well, so our initial strategy when we got in there was to try to find a legal remedy to see if we could get a court injunction to stop the U.S. from being able to hand the property over to Juan Guaido. And so we spent a week or so talking to all sorts of lawyers, and it basically became clear that there's something called the doctrine of non-judiciability, which means that this is a political question, not a legal question. And if the administration recognizes Juan Guaido as the president, the courts are not going to question that. They're going to say, yes, then Juan Guaido is the president. So once we realized that there was no legal recourse, we turned to organizing and bringing as many people to the embassy as we could through these public events, but then also people sleeping over. And so at the height of the people staying in the embassy, we had as many as 70 or so people sleeping there at night. We had students coming at night and then going to school during the day, people sleeping there at night and then going to work, people coming in and working there during the day. So it was a lot of people coming in and out of the embassy. And then that all changed on April 30th.
Yeah, on April 30th, there was a coup attempt in Caracas. Actually, that was the day that Amy Goodman happened to be there for Democracy Now! Doing a story about us. And when we heard about the coup attempt in Caracas, the Foreign Ministry warned us we were likely to see some kind of activity outside the embassy in Washington, D.C. as well. And in fact, we did. And what began to happen were these pro-coup protesters working with the U.S. Secret Service, which was the police that was responsible for the embassy. They worked together to essentially terrorize us. After a couple of days, they got so large, about 100 or 150 people surrounding the embassy. And on 3 sides, the 4th side was a canal. They surrounded the embassy and were threatening us. They were using noisemakers. They were using strobe lights into our eyes, which are blinding. They were threatening sexual assault. They were doing racial attacks on our black allies, homophobic attacks on our gay and queer allies, and just constant attacks. And they actually started to block our food. from getting in. So we had no ability to bring food in, except by various means, which we can talk about as well. And it became a real different kind of environment than it started out as. And so we gradually recognized the challenge, and some people had to leave because of had to go to health reasons, or had to go to work, or had to go to school, had family issues, and so we gradually shrunk down to about 20 or so people, and maybe a little 30.
It was close to 30 when we started making the decision to cut back.
We started making the decision to cut back because of the lack of food, and when they started, then they cut off our electricity, which cut off our water, and that heightened the challenge for us. So we shrunk even further because our goal was to stay as long as possible, protect that embassy, and uphold international law. Why don't you go ahead?
So basically, we were under siege. They surrounded us 24 hours a day. They were very violent and, horrible people, but they were also very disciplined, and they had the support of the police. So they were assaulting, our allies outside, and they were also trying to break into the embassy. There were a few times when folks broke in, and there was one night where they were really terrorizing us. They were banging, there was like a bunch of them banging on this one wooden door so hard that we thought the door was going to break. And when we yelled out the window to the Secret Service and said, they're destroying this door, can you stop them? The Secret Service wouldn't look at us or acknowledge us. And so when we had, our lawyer wrote a letter, contacted the Secret Service, we had people calling, and we called the Secret Service and we said, if they break in, will you guarantee our safety? And they wouldn't respond to that. So at that point, we felt like it was important for us to actually protect ourselves. And so we had to take steps to secure the doors and the windows from the inside to try to prevent them from breaking in. There were still a couple times when they did break in, but that was kind of the atmosphere that we were in. So it was a little intense, and then, trying to figure out how to, we were rationing our food. As soon as they cut our food off, we cut down to 2 small meals a day, and had a lot of conversations about, who would fast and things like that. We gathered water in all the containers that we could find in anticipation that they might cut our power off and our water off. And so we were glad that we did that. So we were taking in the minimal amount of water. And then we made a conscious decision to lower the number of people because we felt it was more important to stay there as long as possible, hoping that a mutual protecting power agreement would be signed. Until May 13th, they delivered this notice to us from Juan Guaido, apparently, on piece of paper with no letterhead, no agency name, no signature, that just said you're being evicted. They came to the front door and they cut the locks off and they opened the door and they said, here's this eviction notice. They put it on the floor and then they said, will you leave voluntarily? And we said, no, we're here legally with the permission of the elected government of Venezuela. If you cross that threshold, you'll be violating the Vienna Convention. You do not have permission to enter this building. And so after an exchange with them for a while, they left and shut the door, put zip ties around it, and said, hey, we're out here. If you want to leave, just knock on the door. We'll let you out. And so that was on a Monday night. On Wednesday, Jesse Jackson showed up, and Jamu and some other folks were there too, and they made a delivery of food that was successful, but it was a huge fight. The pro-coup people, this one guy in particular who was very strong, tried to prevent them, and it literally took a scuffle for us to get the food in, but we got 4 bags of food in that day by lifting them up through a rope and a bag. And so that was very exciting for us to have that food. And then the next day, the police came and they got a warrant for our arrest, and basically they could have just cut the zip ties on the front door and walked in, but instead they brought scores of police from 5 different agencies, some of them wearing combat gear, helmets and flak jackets and rifles and all this stuff, and they used a battering ram to break in one of the side doors to come up to the 2nd floor and get us. And we had told them through correspondence with them that if they did come in, we weren't going to hide, we weren't going to resist. If they decided to violate the Vienna Convention and arrest us, that we would not resist that. But they did this excessive show of force anyway, and so we were arrested on May 16th, the 4 of us, and then the embassy was empty after that point, and they let Carlos Vecchio, the ambassador, come in for one day to do like some photo ops. So basically, the embassy has been empty ever since then, and we're facing federal charges of interfering with federal protective services, something very weird and obscure because they couldn't charge us with trespassing or anything like that. And so for that, we're facing up to a year in jail and a $100,000 fine. And also, they've made it clear that they might also try to charge us for the extra police time and damage to the building, which we did not do. That was the pro-coup people that did really serious damage to the building. So we'll stop.
Let me just add 2 points. One, in addition to the 70 people who slept in the embassy at its peak, and those of us who stayed longer, there were many embassy protectors outside the embassy, and they were critical. I think one of the reasons why the police decided to violate the Vienna Convention and arrest us was because they saw the momentum growing on our side. We were getting larger and larger crowds. Pat McCann, who's on this call, was one of the outside protectors, and he was critical, along with others, in rallying people to come and join us. And some of the great support we got was actually from people in Venezuela. You may see some pictures in here of the protests in Venezuela, solidarity protests in support of our work, calling us heroes and urging, thanking us for putting ourselves on the line for the Venezuelan people and for their independence and showing solidarity in that way. So the outside embassy protectors, both in the United States and in Venezuela, were really critical because we were surrounded by terrorists. They were trying to terrorize us out of there. So having the support of people outside was critical to our being able to stay there, and getting those messages from Venezuela was critical to keep our morale up in the face of terrorism. We'll stop there and take some questions if people have questions about the collective and the criminal charges we're facing.
I've unmuted everyone if anyone has any questions.
Were you able to see those slides? Were they showing?
Yes, we did.
Okay,
Oh, great,
good,
great.
Good. Okay.
If you got any questions about the pictures, that's also fair too.
Anybody have any questions?
All right.
No?
Let's
You
give
wanna go to the next?
let's give a little bit of an update. So, so Venezuela, I think one of the reasons that the United States has not intervened militarily is that Russia and China are allies of Venezuela, and even the European allies that have recognized Juan Guaido, as well as the Lima group, which was formed to kind of be this right-wing Latin American group, have not supported U.S. military intervention. And Russia brought, they've brought some weapons to Venezuela, but they also brought a lot of
weapons, meaning anti-missile weapons,
right,
to defend them
deter
from aerial attack.
Right, by the U.S. And they brought intelligence people as well to support Venezuela. And so the Venezuelan government, military, they've uncovered a number of kind of attempts at really fomenting terrorism within the country. One plot, they've arrested the chief of staff and his bodyguard for Juan Guaido because they found that they were working to try to create these terror cells within the country using money that the U.S. stole from Venezuela, assets from within the U.S., to bring mercenaries from Central American countries in and do assassinations, attacks on infrastructure like the power outages. So that was uncovered. There was another plot that they were going to bring teams in from Colombia, and there were Israeli Defense Force soldiers in Colombia to participate in this, oddly enough. And they were going to raid some of these police stations, take their weapons, and then go in the streets and massacre people and cause chaos, as well as trying to massacre President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. And so that plot was also uncovered. And so the United States is not giving up. It's just trying to find other ways to go about this. The Organization of American States has been, a tool in this as well. They're a U.S.-dominated institution. And that vote that they did, that manipulated vote to recognize Juan Guaido, has really hurt the OAS. And member countries of the OAS have stood up to that, have taken action, have condemned it. It'll be interesting to see what happens, because I think the current head was even kicked out of his party, Luis Almagro, because of the actions that he's taking. Because what the countries see is, hey, if the OAS can change the rules and manipulate this and recognize some guy as the president of Venezuela, then they could do that to our country too when we're under the crosshairs. And so that's caused a lot of unrest in those countries.
Let me just one point to add to what Margaret's been saying, what we told you about the collective. It really shows how well the media is controlled in the United States. You heard nothing in the U.S. about these U.S. terror plots attempting to cause terrorism in Venezuela, paid for by money stolen by the United States from Venezuela. You've heard nothing about Israeli defense forces on the border in Colombia prepared to go in. You heard nothing about the Embassy Protection Collective. That was a made-for-TV movie. 37 days we were in there with all sorts of great stories in the beginning with those forums. I mean, you have a former CIA head talking about what regime change is like from inside the CIA, that there's a CIA regime change office that Congress does not even know about. He talked about that. He talked about how it operates. That should have been a news story. And then he had the conflict with us and the coup supporters and our supporters as well on top of that. So you had this multi-level conflict going on outside for weeks, not covered in the middle of Washington, D.C., in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Georgetown, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in D.C., not covered in the media. Now, we heard after we got out that many people monitored it, through live streams and through Twitter and, social media. And many people in Latin America watched it on Telesur because Telesur covered it pretty aggressively. Many people in Latin America know about the terror plots. That's been reported in Latin American press, not in U.S. press. And so it really just highlights for you how we are kept in the dark, misled, lied to in order to create a situation that allows for escalation of conflict. Now you have this Amazon TV show that's just coming on, this propaganda show about Venezuela getting nuclear weapons and threatening the United States. I mean, it's amazing. They hide the truth and create these lies in order to manufacture consent for escalation of conflict between the United States and Venezuela.
So just a couple other things to touch on. One is the State Department just recently opened what they're calling the Venezuelan Affairs Unit in Bogota, Colombia, and this basically is going to be their base of operations. The reason that Venezuela and the United States broke off diplomatic relations in March is that the U.S. Embassy in Caracas was being used as a base to organize the opposition. And, and Venezuela finally said, you can't keep doing that here. And so
then when Margaret says organize the opposition, they were threatening people who wanted to run for president. You can't run for president.
Yeah, you have to boycott the election.
They were threatening, even the top opposition candidate was threatened with sanctions for running for office.
Yeah.
Henry Falcon. And then they were trying to encourage people not to go out and vote. Why were the United States doing that? Because they wanted to delegitimize the election. They knew they couldn't win. The opposition was unpopular. They couldn't win the elections. They had to delegitimize it. And they did that by trying to create a boycott. It didn't work. They still had almost 50% turnout. And Maduro got 67% of the vote in a 5-person race. And so they failed in that. But that's what the embassy was being used for, was for undermining Venezuelan democracy.
Right. And also recently, Venezuela uncovered terrorist training camps just across the border inside Colombia. They notified the Colombian government about these terror camps and said, we'd like you to dismantle them. Colombia basically, thumbed their nose at them for that. On August 5th, President Trump signed an executive order basically creating a blockade of Venezuela. It's a very broad executive order that basically says, like, anybody that that tries to help or support the Maduro government in any way can be, targeted. They can keep people out of the United States. They can sanction them. Who knows what they can do, but that has created real problems with food shipments and things being able to get through to Venezuela. Now, on the good side,
well, let me just add to you one point on that. Okay. on the thing. Trump also talked about using Navy ships to actually blockade Venezuela, physically blockade it. Just before Trump that came out in public, President Putin and the Venezuelan government agreed that Russia would keep Russian Navy ships at the ports in Venezuela. That was announced before the Trump story came out. And so I think that's been a kind of a checkmate or a deterrent on the U.S. escalating in that way. But Russia has been critical, not just supplying missile defense, supplying intelligence officers, and supplying money to make up for the U.S. loss, and also Navy. And China as well has put in $5 billion into Venezuela's oil industry, and as you said, they're also providing medications.
Right. But on the good news side, in July of this year, the non-aligned movement had its meeting in Caracas, and the non-aligned movement was formed in the 1970s. It was a block of countries that said it was kind of to counter U.S. domination. They're basically saying we're not pro-U.S., we're not anti-U.S., we're just not aligned. And they affirmed their support for
in those days, there was the Soviet Union.
Right.
They were not aligned with both the U.S. empire and the Soviet empire.
Right.
Now there's no Soviet. In fact, Russia is now
an ally.
An ally to the non-aligned movement.
But they affirmed their support for President Maduro, and they also affirmed their support for the United Nations Charter, because all the things that the United States is doing against Venezuela, and of course in other countries as well, are in violation of the UN Charter. You can't put unilateral coercive economic measures on another country. You can't interfere with their politics. You can't threaten them or with military aggression or act with the military aggression towards them. So this bloc of 120 countries is now saying we need to follow the United Nations Charter. And so Venezuela has been very smart in building that support. And our hope is that there will be some action taken in the United Nations to start to counter the U.S. domination of that institution and to do, really start to hold the U.S. accountable. Now, we also are part of launching an effort called the Global Appeal for Peace. And there's a website, Global Appeal with the number 4, peace.net. And this is building a worldwide coalition of people and organizations that also believe that we should hold countries accountable for their violations of international law, violations of the UN Charter. And so this is an effort that has just begun, but it's something we've been talking about even when we were in Iran in February and down in Venezuela. And it seems like a lot of different places are having these same conversations. And so we're starting to connect with other people and start to form this network.
And please go to Global Appeal for Peace, sign on to that. We're going to be delivering signatures to the UN when the UN General Assembly meets in 2 weeks. We could go on to the final section, which is kind of lessons from this as far as tactics and strategies for people, or we could take questions right now, Chris, whichever you think makes more sense.
You're muted.
Does anyone have a quick question? I'd say go on.
A couple of comments.
Go ahead.
Yeah, people should know that we went down there on our delegation, and we were there for the Sao Paulo Forum. And the week before that was the 120 countries of the non-aligned movement. Both of those were in Caracas, in the month of May. So that was a very wonderful thing that both of those major events happened. There were 713 international delegates at the Sao Paulo Forum. And it's just a wonderful thing that those things happened back to back in May.
July.
So I just wanted to make that. Yeah. The other thing is, I think that, and we've lost a couple of people. I see we've lost Mark, the guy from Palm Beach County. So I definitely want to try and make sure that when we end this, I can get his contact. Of the 25 top Venezuelan demographics in America, 23 of them are in Florida and 2 of them are in New York. So at some point, I'd like to talk perhaps with you, Margaret and Kevin, about how we can, you can help us to build some fight back in South Florida, where we've been active and where we've had 3 or 4 rallies of, up to 50, 60 people. We had Max Blumenthal down. We'd probably like to either bring you all down or Dan Kovalik down. So I'll leave it at that. But it's been on for a while, and I was hoping we would get a little bit to what we can do.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we're doing, Patrick, is that as part of the defense of our criminal charges, the Embassy Defenders Defense Committee is organizing tours for us. We're going to be doing a tour on the West Coast in the Bay Area in October. We're talking about a Northeast tour as well. And we're doing events, of course, around the people's mobilization to stop U.S. wars in New York. And I could see doing a Southeast tour or a Florida tour at some point. So we should definitely talk about that because we see this is not the end. We see this as this prosecution as a tool to educate and organize and mobilize people to change U.S. policy toward Venezuela at this critical time with the 2020 election season developing. We really need to get the voice out of people who oppose U.S. intervention and want to see this kind of constant violation of international law by the United States stopped.
So should we get on to the final section? We wanted to talk a little bit about tactics and organizing. And so, when we first went into the embassy, we just went in there thinking we're going to see what we can do to try to hold this space and prevent them from taking it over, because we know that if we were on the outside, we can't. So we really didn't know what we were going to do. And like I said, we tried the legal approach first. And then when that failed, it was just like, get as many people here, get as much media, get as much attention, make it politically unpalatable for them to take over this embassy. And so that quickly became an organizing challenge. Who do you let into the embassy? So we had a very strict security protocol. We were doing watches around the building all day and all night, taking shifts outside during the day and inside during the night. We had a very strict protocol for who could get into the building based on who they were, what parts of the building they could access. And then as we started getting a lot of people staying over, we started doing a lot of organizing around people in charge of assigning rooms, people in charge of cleaning,
Cooking.
in charge of cooking, managing the kitchen and the food, and in charge of the organizing the watches, doing the media. So it was a big, very big kind of logistical operation. We were so busy in there. We thought, we can work here during the day, but actually no, it was like constant. And then at night, there's concerns. Are the police coming? There were the break-ins, all this that's going on. So it was
and the logistics changed as the coup mob came to be outside and
right.
The food got blocked. Then there were all sorts of logistics about getting food in. There was all sorts of fantastic efforts by our allies to get food into the embassy, successful a lot of the time, so that we never ran out of food. We never ran out of water, despite electricity being off and water being off and food being blocked. We were able to survive, and we actually were able to gather water from two cisterns we built on the roof. And we were able to cook on a solar oven on the roof, as well as cook on the car. When we were charging our phones on the car, we also were cooking our tortillas on the engine. And so, we learned, and we also learned you could cook pasta just just by soaking it in regular temperature water. After a couple hours, you had pasta.
Same thing with lentils. If you soak them for about a day, they get soft enough to eat.
So lots of lessons on tactics from that. Yeah. I think the major thing that I would like to get across people on tactics is that when you do something like this, and then we've seen this over and over on many projects we've worked on, whether it's the Occupy movement, stopping the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the healthcare efforts that we're working on, we've seen it with this. But we didn't know when we started this what would happen. I was asked by one of the embassy staff, do we think we can really stop this by doing what we're doing? We said, we don't know. We don't know what the police are going to do. We don't know what the opposition is going to do. We don't know what our supporters are going to do. We don't know what the media is going to do. Lots of unknowns. And all you can do is put the effort in to making something happen, taking the risk, not being afraid of failure, and being able to adjust depending on what circumstances developed. And we had to adjust multiple times, but I think it had a lot of success in drawing attention to this, in showing solidarity with Venezuela, in educating people in Venezuela and the United States what was going on, and really, I think, advanced the cause a great deal, and we'll continue to, as Patrick says, we're going to continue to be working on how we can stop this Venezuela policy, and how we can use even the federal prosecution against us as a tool to organize and mobilize people.
So a couple other things that we did. One is we knew that the media, if they did cover us, was not going to cover us favorably. And so we decided that our palette to get our message out was the building. And so very early on, we started doing, messaging. We did a timeline of the coup that we put in all the windows. There were 32 windows along the first floor at the bottom. So we did 32 little pieces of information about the coup so people could walk by and you could see them. They would walk by and read it. We did these big boards about, U.S. regime change tactics and listed them. We did outcomes of U.S. regime change attempts and listed the devastating outcomes. We did big, painted banners on the front of the building because we knew that if the media was shooting pictures of the building, our message would be in the picture no matter what they said. Our message would get out. And then we also had embedded media. Telesur was inside with us until the siege came and they had to go outside because they weren't allowed to just have someone in there. But Mint Press News and Gray Zone Project had media with us almost until the end. And so they were able to do social media. We were able to do interviews, and we did webinars from inside, so that people could watch those. So we did whatever we could to get our version of what was happening out. And
I'll just add to that it's not just the message itself, it's the process of developing the message. Some of the pictures you may have seen, art builds. Mm-hmm. We had people join us at the embassy to make those banners, to make those signs. We had great photographs for our social media of us making those signs and banners, of children and families inside the embassy. We wanted to get across to the government that if they attacked the embassy, there were families in there.
Yeah,
and there were children in the embassy with their parents. And so that process was part of it. And even the forums we did on the various different issues, those were designed because we wanted to reach different audiences. We did a forum on Honduras, on Nicaragua, on Africa, on Palestine, because we wanted those communities to be aware of what was going on. We were building our network from the ground up. You don't start with those who oppose you. You start with those who are allied. And so people in Honduras who have suffered through a coup know what a coup means and know that what we're doing is preventing a coup. And so we do a session on Honduras, and the Honduras community knows about it. The same thing with the AFRICOM and the Nicaraguan communities. And that's how I think, people outside began to build. We had a lot of those communities then come out to support us. We had a lot of those communities then echoing our messages on social media. And so that building process, the process is as important as the sign.
And one other quick thing that was important was also, there were times inside of the embassy when it was very tense, very scary, and people, were a little freaked out. And so there were some times when we needed to just pull back, all of us, away from the windows, away from the noise and the lights, and just turn on some music, just let that out for a little bit, or to just pull together in one room and start sharing about what we were feeling at that moment. And those were very important moments because, when the power was turned off, when we lost our water, I guess it was actually the worst night was when they were trying to break that wooden door down.
That's right.
And we all just kind of got together in this one room and talked about how we felt. And we started feeling, as we started sharing what we were feeling, we also started recognizing that what we were experiencing was a very small taste of what the Venezuelans have been experiencing as being the target of U.S. imperialism for so long. And so it just deepened our resolve with the Venezuelan people. As our power was lost, as our water was lost, as our food supplies got low, we just felt even greater solidarity with the Venezuelans.
So we were in Venezuela during their blackout. We were in their embassy during our blackout. The same thing with food and water. We were in Venezuela for that, and we were in the embassy for that. Our experience was much smaller, but it gave us a sense of solidarity with the Venezuelan people and what U.S. imperialism does.